In addition to that, if you have questions that you would like to ask, please post them in the chat as we go along. Our presenters will do our best to answer the questions as we go along, and we have some time for questions at the end. And if there's any that we don't have time to answer, we will get back to you after the webinar, after the hour's up. So thanks very much for that. And Michelle, I'll pass over you to do a more formal introduction of the webinar. Thanks.
Thanks, Brad. Good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are across the globe. My name's Michelle Randall and I work for Cattle Council of Australia. I'm coming to you live from Canberra this evening. And to introduce the webinar a bit, I'll just give you a little bit of background. When it comes to climate action, the Australian red meat sector has been very proactive so far. The red meat industry is on track to becoming carbon neutral by 2030, which was a target set by the industry back in 2017. The red meat industry has already reduced net emissions by more than any other sector in the economy, and through proactively reducing methane and storing carbon, Australia's red meat producers can continue to play a key role in sustainable, secure food systems globally. Now, some of you may have heard that there is a large international event happening in Egypt called COP27, and COP stands for Conference of the Parties, with parties referring to the 197 nations that agreed to the United Nations Climate Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC, back in 1992. And this event is taking place in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt as we speak. And it's all about countries getting together to talk about what needs to happen to address climate change globally. To discuss what's actually going on at COP27, I will now hand over to Edwina Close from Meat and Livestock Australia, and also Mark Wooten, a red meat producer from Jigsaw Farms, and they're coming to us live from Egypt at COP27. Thank you, Edwina.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Probably just best to quickly recap on Glasgow last year. It was an important discussion and conference because it was the first time that our countries had to report back on their target emissions progress. Also, of course, the Global Methane Pledge came out of Glasgow. So this year's COP in Sharm is probably a little bit more subdued, just focusing on the implementation, the methodology and the reporting behind the country's emissions targets, commitments and how they're progressing. And I think also with the change of venue, the move from Glasgow to Egypt, I think it would be fair to say that perhaps the focus has shifted slightly from a real focus on climate change and decarbonisation to a broader focus also on food security and food supply. It's a big conference. There's a lot coming out. There's the government, intergovernment discussions. There's the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change, which is the lead scientific body assessing climate change. In addition to that, there's this huge layer of industry, other government, organisations, sector and NGO discussions. So there's a lot going on, and that's the real challenge, trying to discern what's happening across these meetings and make sense of it. In addition to that, these events are themed. The days are broken up into thematics. So we've had the Finance Day. Yesterday was the Science Day. Today is the Decarbonisation Day. Tomorrow's the Adaptation and Agriculture Day. There's Water Day, Biodiversity Day, and so it goes on. And of course, the discussion on Global Pledge, the Global Methane Pledge will happen today. There'll be more discussions, we believe, on the Agricultural Day in terms of the food and agriculture sustainable transformation and the strategy, the policies and the finance behind that. But our industry, our Australian livestock and agriculture industry, we believe has got a pretty solid presence here, particularly today in the Decarbonisation Day and tomorrow on the Agricultural Day, with lots of discussions and our stakeholders presenting on the Decarbonisation and Agricultural Days at the Australian Government Pavilion and also the international, one of the international pavilions as well. And included in our speakers are Mark Wooten from Jigsaw Farms, Fiona Simpson and Tony Marr representing the National Farmers Federation. We've got Michelle Gorton from MacDoc Group and Diana Gibbs and Sarah Bray from Forest Products and Sam Gill from Meat and Livestock Australia. And we're coming with some pretty strong priorities and messages, as Michelle mentioned, that we are part of the climate solution, that we went in early with a CN30 target, and we're making big progress, substantial progress to achieve that. The industry has a really important part to play in terms of food security and food supply, and that what we need from government is policies that are supportive and financially support our industry doing what we need to do. That's us in a nutshell. I guess we're just really trying to get a read of what the discussions are at, leading into those discussions, really trying to be active with our connections across government, industry and investors, and establishing a presence here so that we can create more impact going forward at subsequent COPs. So that's me in a nutshell. I might pass over to Mark Wooten from Jigsaw Farms, who's been here on the ground for a number of days, to give you a little bit more detail. Thanks.
Thanks, Edwina. Look, I'm here. I'm in a hotel foyer with a screaming baby who's luckily just left the foyer. The beautiful background music. And we have very poor connectivity issues. So that's why I'm actually not actually at the COP where I've been the last few days. I think the best way of describing it to people outside, it is a complete zoo, in a good zoo with good people. But it's better to be inside the zoo than being an endangered species sitting outside the zoo. So it's a really good space to be. As Edwina said, it is an implementation themed, the COP. And so people are really keen on practical solutions on what we're doing. And that's where the Australian story sits so well. And food and ag is massive. I mean, it's a really big space in here, food and fibre, and it's a really positive space to be in, but it is a confusing space. So that's why it's useful to be here. We're in a space where there is so many conversations. I went into one of the pavilions yesterday and I counted there were 12 forums going on at the same time, and from all sorts, but there is a common goodwill and there's a common acceptance that the farming community and the forestry community have a lot to offer going forward, as being part of the solution and not part of the problem. So I've been quite disappointed in some of the politics of these things in the past, and I'm feeling really pretty upbeat that we're in a really good space here. The Australian story has been really well represented, and it's been used in a number of forums. Just some from left field. I've been in an audience. They said, "Oh, you're from Australia. Tell us what's happening yesterday," and you just have to stand up and let it rip. There's a whole grouping every morning of all the primary producers / industries where they get together for an hour and they talk about what was on the day before. Then they come forward and they say, "Can we get people to these events today to make sure that our interests have been represented?" So an Irish guy might go talk about some of the benefits there. There's an American dairy guy at some of the ones yesterday I went to who was promoting stuff. But there's a very strong theme going forward. Tonight we're doing one, as Edwina said before, with Fiona Simpson's talking. We've got Sam Elson talking about the asparagus. We've got the forestry side. We've got Michelle talking about sustainability. And it's just this broad reach to saying we've got stuff going on in the red meat industry. We're not just talking about it in Australia, we're actually doing it and we're actually learning. We haven't got all the answers, but we've got some of the solutions in our pockets coming forward, but we think we'd like to work with you, and from a tech point of view, from a research point of view, and take any other tools you've got, but recognise we're part of this solution. So it's a really, once a day or two to get adjusted for the sleep side of things, and Egypt's a pretty unusual place. It's a really positive feeling, and I think that as Australian producers, you should feel really pretty happy in how we're represented, but more importantly, that we are on that leading edge of what's going on, and that story's been told consistently. I could keep going, but I won't. Oh yeah, well actually there is one more. There's one tomorrow, which is really the amazing one, and again looking as meat being significant as coming forward. So we've also got, we're doing an international one tomorrow where Fiona and I are both speaking. I'll talk about our story, but Fiona talks in general more about Australian ag. And we've got like the head honcho from the International Meat Secretariat talking about red meat and some of the work that's going on there. We've got a small producer who's the chief executive of the small farm holdings from Malawi. We've got the president of the World Farmer Organization up on the panel with us. So there's an array of these players that, and we're just saying we're all working in the same direction. same purpose, different pathways to get there, perhaps depending on your regional, your climate area. And you just, once you drill into it, it's information overload, to be honest with you. I just can't absorb it all. There's so much going on. And I think afterwards I'll just have to sleep for a week to recover. But other than that, it's a really good story. So and the MLA, I should have said this at the beginning, all that footage that was done on our farm is the backdrop for all the brochures and is regularly being played in a lot of places. With the integration of biodiversity, trees, and obviously our sheep and cattle. And everywhere I turn, I see it on a brochure or something. So it's a really positive story. I think that might be enough from me. Do you think, Michelle? Is that
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Edwina. We really appreciate those insights on the ground over there. And yeah, Mark and Edwina need to shoof off now. They've obviously got a lot of meetings and they won't be staying with us for the duration of the webinar, but we look forward to hearing more about how it all goes and reporting back to industry on COP27. So all the best with it, and thanks very much for your presentation. Next up in the webinar, we've got Margaret Jewell from Meat and Livestock Australia. Margaret is MLA's Carbon Neutral 2030 Manager. She's an agricultural scientist with a PhD in plant genetics and 10 years experience in intensive and extensive agriculture. So with that, I'll pass over to Margaret, who will speak for about the next 15 minutes.
Thanks, Brad, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm coming to you from the MLA office in Brisbane, which is right next to the RNA showground, and they're currently having a big concert. So I'm really hoping that the background noise isn't going to interfere too much with the presentation today. So as Brad said, my name's Margaret and I manage really all of the on-farm sustainability investments that are happening within the research and development side of things at MLA, and that includes the Carbon Neutral by 2030 initiative. Today I will talk through some of the drivers that have made industry embark on the CN30 target, and then touch on the progress that we've made as well. So the Australian red meat industry have an overarching vision to double the value of Australian red meat sales as the trusted source of the highest quality protein. And achieving carbon neutrality has been called out as a key success indicator of that vision. So that just demonstrates that our industry first and foremost focused on improving the prosperity of Australian red meat producers and the industry as a whole. And we see that achieving carbon neutrality is a really important part of that because of the opportunities to access emerging markets that are requiring environmental sustainability credentials to be attached to products. So CN30 is a target for the Australian red meat industry to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, and it's a coordinated research, development and adoption effort. Meat and Livestock Australia are the service provider to the red meat industry, and we invest in research, development, adoption and marketing activities, and we require cooperation amongst all industry stakeholders to be successful at this target. So we're working really extensively with federal and state government departments, research organisations, universities, and of course all of our red meat industry stakeholders as well. A really important aspect of CN30 is that it does not require every single individual producer in Australia to achieve a carbon neutral position, but rather it recognises the high potential and opportunity that we have in Australia to store carbon in the landscape that can then be used to offset the emissions that we are unable to reduce. So we have a baseline year of 2005 in line with the Paris Agreement, and every year the CSIRO do an analysis for us to determine where we're sitting annually with our emissions. And the latest data that we've done this analysis with was for 2019, and we showed that between 2005 and 2019 we reduced emissions by almost 60%, which is a really fantastic achievement, and our industry are really proud of having achieved that. Important to note that it is a net zero target. So as I said, emissions that we're unable to reduce from the industry will be offset with carbon stored in the landscape. And the vast majority of that 60% has been due to changed vegetation management in Australia. And I guess when Australia was first settled by Europeans, we did introduce some unsustainable agricultural practices that involved a lot of tree clearing, but now our producers are really aware of the benefits that including trees in the landscape bring, not only to storing carbon, but also by providing shade and shelter for livestock, which can improve their productivity. And there's also a bunch of other benefits, such as increased biodiversity, improved water and soil health and pasture health, and overall ecosystem health in production systems. We are focusing on reducing emissions as well, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. There's a lot of opportunities in Australia to use existing husbandry practices and genetics and improved diet quality to reduce emissions, and we have seen that incremental improvements in emissions over time, but the next steps for CN30 really do require us to have a laser focus on emissions as well as carbon storage. So since 2017, we've invested about $140 million directly into initiatives that are focused on the CN30 target. As this is a COP27 seminar, I wanted to give a little bit of a picture of the global context, and that's pretty relevant for me because I did spend a bit of time in the EU and the UK quite recently. So I guess something that sort of sets us apart from the rest of the world with this target is that it is really ambitious. So we were one of the first countries in the world to set such an ambitious target when we set it in 2017. And while it sort of required a bit of awareness raising amongst producers so that they could understand what it means, there's a lot of pride in this target now. And our industry are aware of the challenges ahead and the future market drivers, and have confidence that industry have got this goal, and are thinking ahead and thinking of those drivers so that we can meet these new emerging market opportunities when they arise. The goal has also given our government confidence that we've got this covered, which means that it reduces the need for them to step in with regulatory mechanisms to try and instigate industry change. So in Australia, we're custodians of over 355 million hectares of land. So it's about half of Australia's landmass, and less than 8% of that is suitable for production of anything other than ruminants. So as I said, what this means is that we've got a huge opportunity to store carbon in trees and soils across the Australian landscape, which sets us apart from a lot of European countries in the north, where systems can be a lot more intensive, and there's not so much opportunity to store carbon through land management changes. We've also got a pretty small proportion of our herd in intensive systems at any one time, which is something else that sets us apart. So our challenges in Australia really are focused on reducing enteric methane emissions rather than nitrous oxide emissions, which can be more of a contributor to the suite of emissions in systems in the north, where animals are required to be housed in fully covered shelters or partially covered shelters for at least some period of their lives. We've got, I'll move on from there now. Something that is really important and a focus for us in CN30 is the fact that we really do recognise that we need to reduce our methane emissions by quite a lot in order to achieve the target. But this is also a bit of an opportunity for our red meat producers as well. So when livestock consume feed, a lot of the energy from that feed is lost as a byproduct, which is methane, and a lot is also converted into live weight gain. So if we can instead redirect the feed energy that's lost as methane into live weight gain, there's some pretty substantial advantages for our production systems. So in fact, the amount of methane that's lost in grazing animals is equivalent to about 33 to 60 grazing days per year for cattle and about 30 to 31 grazing days per year for sheep. So that's why we do have such a focus on looking at really intensive feed additive technologies that can substantially reduce those methane emissions. So while we've got technologies that can reduce emissions per kilogram of live weight produced now, we do recognise that we need to bring some more intensive technologies into common practice so that we can make some big gains towards reducing our emissions. Something else that sets us apart is that our target in Australia is very much industry-led and voluntary. So Australia are one of the least subsidised countries in the world for agriculture. And this means that rather than having government driving through incentives or through regulatory approaches the changes that producers are making on their farm, we're really focused on encouraging producers to adopt practices that are going to have the best outcomes for their businesses. So regardless of carbon, we want producers in Australia to be adopting practices that will enable them to improve productivity and at the same time have a carbon benefit. We're also focused on enabling opportunities for our producers to be remunerated or benefited in some way for adopting new practices and being able to report on their net emissions positions. And those include at the moment the carbon market in Australia, and there's also a lot of emerging supply chain opportunities, which I'll touch on a little bit later. This does come with some adoption challenges because we don't have the government sort of stepping in to drive where they want our producers to go. And we are working on awareness raising activities for producers and also really trying to support them to get to the start line, I guess, so that they can be ready to run the race if that's something that they choose to do. Something that really resonates with farmers in Australia is this concept of carbon use efficiency. So we're very familiar with terminology like nitrogen use efficiency and water use efficiency, but carbon use efficiency isn't something that's talked about very much, which is strange because carbon makes up the vast majority of what is actually in the livestock that we're producing. So something that we like to familiarise farmers with is that if they can maximise the amount of carbon that's sequestered through photosynthesis into forages and then is either converted into soil carbon or goes into trees or goes into livestock to increase their live weight gain and reduce the carbon that's wasted from that system, then that's going to result in the most efficient system for them, which is going to have productivity advantages. And this is why in Australia, we know that we can achieve our productivity goals and improve our productivity while at the same time reaching our CN30 target. So we're encouraging producers to be really intimately familiar with their businesses by doing a business plan and then to look at that business plan through a carbon lens so that they can look at when they adopt a new practice, how does that change the way that carbon flows through their business and how does that ultimately result in improvements to their productivity? We're trying to help them decide which carbon opportunities to pursue. And I've mentioned that we have an active carbon market in Australia and there are emerging mechanisms to enable producers to participate in supply chain opportunities as well. And we're also working with them to help them understand which practices on farm are going to be the best for their businesses and offer them the best return on investment. Some of those are available now and some others like the feed additives that we're investing in are going to be available in the future. So there is opportunity for producers to start thinking about that now so that they can be ready for those things when they're available. Another really important aspect for us in Australia when we think of the international context is that we export a lot of our product. So over 70% of the red meat that we produce is exported, and we export to over 100 countries. So that means that we want to be really aware of the market drivers that are coming at us from the international perspective, as well as those that are in the domestic realm in Australia. We've got a few early movers in the supply chain space in Australia. So we've got 4 certified carbon neutral red meat brands in Australia. All of those have achieved their carbon neutral position by understanding their baseline emissions and then purchasing offsets. This is a perfectly acceptable way for those early movers to get into the space first. But in all cases, they have a plan to implement new technologies so that they can reduce their reliance on purchased offsets over time, eventually with the aim of becoming a fully carbon neutral organisation within their own production systems. And I've also got a couple of pictures on that slide with low carbon red meat products and fully inset red meat products that have been developed in other countries. So just to finish off, I'll really quickly go through our CN30 roadmap, which was developed in 2020, and it's gone through a couple of updates already and is probably due for another one. It outlines these 4 work areas which provide the framework for the activities that we're conducting at MLA to achieve CN30. I've talked about some of these before, but I'll just run through them quickly again. So the first work area is industry leadership, and this is sort of our adoption piece. So it's about building leadership capacity and competency amongst all of the stakeholders in the red meat industry. And we're doing this through developing learning resources and engaging with the industry to help with their awareness and understanding of carbon and how it flows through their systems. In the greenhouse gas emissions avoidance work area, we're focused on existing technologies and improving them and scaling up adoption. And so, as I've said, they include genetic technologies as well as herd management and flock management practices, and improving the feed base. So including legumes where possible, and then high quality forage mixes as well. In the carbon storage work area, we're focused on raising awareness of how producers can integrate trees into their production system, regardless of whether they want to have a income stream from timber production, but in ways that they can have a carbon storage benefit, but also have those multiple other co-benefits for their production systems as well, so that it can actually improve the productivity of the livestock that's being produced. We're also working on some soil carbon projects, so we're increasing the data set that underpins what happens in response to certain grazing management practices in Australia in terms of how much soil carbon can be built. And we're also working really hard to reduce the costs that are associated with soil carbon measurement. And then lastly, the integrated management systems work area. In this one, we're mainly focused on working with the federal government to make sure that the frameworks are in place to enable producers that are adopting these new practices to be able to account for the emissions reductions that they're achieving for those and ultimately be benefited from them. We've got lots and lots of tools and resources available at MLA. This is just a list of some of them, and we're easy to find. You can contact us through the website and we're able to direct you to any of these resources or other resources if you need them. So that's it from me. Thanks very much for having me speak today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the session.
Thanks, Margaret, for that great presentation. Next up, we've got Nick Blong. Just while Nick's bringing up his PowerPoint to screen share, I'll just introduce him. He's the First Assistant Secretary, Portfolio Strategy and Climate Change Division with the Australian Government. And the topic of his presentation is government perspectives on emissions reduction in the ag sector. So with that, I'll hand over to you, Nick. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. Good to be with you all. Hopefully you can see my presentation okay and hear me okay. I'll just do a sort of a tech check before I sort of launch into it. All okay?
If you just want to switch it to presentation.
Sorry.
Right. Yeah.
There we go. Is that better? Is that okay?
Yeah, we can see your notes. That's
how about you present for me, Brad? So that's all right. I trust me to sort of be the tech problem at the end of the day. But yes, while Brad's bringing it up, I'll just quickly, I guess, welcome. Well, thanks for having me this afternoon or this evening, depending on where you're joining me from. I'm joining you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country here in Canberra. This shot's sort of just taken about 15 minutes out of Canberra and sort of Wallaroo. Unfortunately, I'm in my sort of drab office this afternoon. I don't have any sort of screaming babies nearby that are going to interrupt me, but there is a Crowded House concert across the road that might kick off any moment now. So we'll wait to see what happens. So yeah, big shout out to sort of the delegates in Egypt at COP27 who've had a busy few days, and I'm keen to sort of hear what happens in the days and weeks ahead. And also for sort of colleagues joining on the call as well today. I'm going to sort of just quickly sort of set the scene at a sort of a bigger picture level, and then sort of dive into sort of what government role is in this space as a bit of an enabler, and sort of build off some of Margaret's points as well on sort of the CN30 agenda. So really kind of what I've got here is some facts and figures just to help kind of build that kind of macro level picture, and also obviously with a new government, they've sort of made some sort of early announcements around sort of legislating climate targets and things like that, including the 43% sort of net reduction on 2005 levels, and achieving that sort of target by 2030, and then the longer term sort of net zero emissions target by 2050. So, and there's also a bunch of kind of legislation around your reporting and being transparent around sort of carbon emissions and progress towards those goals as well. I won't bore you with all that, but I think some of these charts might be interesting. Sort of the one on the left, I guess, gives that sort of context around where Australian agriculture fits in to the bigger scheme of things in terms of national emissions. So Australian agriculture as a whole contributes 16.1% of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. You can sort of see how we compare to other sectors. I guess, what's interesting is, about 80% of Australian agricultural emissions are methane emissions. And you would have perhaps, heard or read commentary around sort of the global methane pledge over the last few weeks. And Edwina mentioned in Egypt, it's sort of been discussed at COP27 a fair bit in recent days too. And, and this isn't by any stretch sort of just focused on agriculture as an emitter of methane, because lots of sectors are bigger emitters, but methane does matter. It's for context, it's about 28 times more potent as a greenhouse gas compared to carbon dioxide. So reducing methane compared to other greenhouse gases does have, quite a big impact when you're trying to sort of limit those emissions and greenhouse impacts. I guess on the upside, methane doesn't hang around the atmosphere as long as some of the other gases. So methane hangs around for about 10 to 15 years compared to, carbon dioxide, which hangs around for, 10 times longer or so. So that's why, cutting methane emissions can make a difference. It's more potent, and also if you stop producing methane now, it has an earlier impact in terms of getting rid of some of those greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. So anyway, there's going to be a lot more smarter scientists than me on the call, so I'm not going to pretend to lecture you on sort of greenhouse gas emissions, but I think it's a point worth making given sort of some of the commentary we've heard over the last sort of month or so in this space. On the right, just sort of presenting some ABARES analysis. So that really sort of just provides a bit of a national snapshot on where they've done some work around measuring the impacts on farm profitability due to seasonal conditions sort of changing over the last 20 years. And you can see it sort of varies quite a lot region by region. The national average is around a 23% impact on farm profitability, which is obviously quite significant, and why taking action matters. Let's get you to flip to the next slide if you can, Brad. Thanks for doing that for me. So really, I'm not going to dwell on this slide too much, but I think picking up on some of Margaret's points around sort of the CN30 agenda, and again, sort of painting a broader picture of Australian agriculture, and you'll sort of hear this term used quite a lot around sort of climate smart agriculture, and certainly the investments you've seen from industry, how Australian agriculture seeks to position itself in the world. We're obviously a big exporter. Most of what we produce in terms of food and fibre is exported. And so positioning ourselves as an exporter of climate smart and sustainable agriculture and food is a really important objective. And it's great that we're able to sort of position Australia as a leader in that space. I guess sort of reflecting on some of these themes in a bit more detail, what does this all mean? It means about sort of using the natural environment to, look after natural capital, to improve farm profitability through, good natural capital measures, and that obviously achieves, environmental benefits as well. We know that kind of also links in with responding to changing consumer markets and trading partner expectations, and positioning Australia to sort of be a reliable, trusted supplier of high quality food and fibre, and us having kind of the systems and traceability and credentials in place to sort of back that in. And that all sort of then sort of a longer term sort of feeds into the long term sort of transition to net zero and realising the opportunities it presents. I might sort of spend a bit more time on the next slide, if that's okay, Brad, because I think this kind of then paints a bit of a picture of kind of where you're seeing some activity from government, not just federal government, but states and territories as well, and why the partnership between governments and industry and trading partners really matters, and while there's a lot of investment in this space. So obviously many on the call will be familiar with sort of the significant investment that flows through our R&D corporations. It's about 300 million or so from the Commonwealth, and that obviously is topped up by sort of industry levy contributions as well, of course. So that's that's a significant investment in innovation and R&D, and of course extension measures as well. So that's a long-standing system that you'll all be familiar with. I guess some of the more recent sort of measures that you might be slightly less familiar with, certainly things around the methane emissions reduction in livestock program, also known as the Merrill program, which has been around for a couple of years. Just a couple of weeks ago, new grant recipients were sort of announced, and that's really focusing on trying to sort of really prioritise that investment in different feed supplements that can support methane's reduction in livestock, getting a sense of making how you measure them in terms of in different sort of conditions, taking it from the lab to different sort of feedlot systems, and even looking at how feed supplements can be used in pasture production as well. Seaweed and Asparagopsis is talked about a lot. Certainly the government's budget last week or in October sort of added to some R&D investment in that space to look at commercialisation options. And again, much like that's also received funding for the Merrill program as well, to see in different conditions what impact this is having on emissions, but also the productivity benefits, and also then in terms of carbon accounting, and Margaret referred to this as well, the role of government in being able to sort of back in some of these credentials and measure emissions in a way that allow sort of the producers to be credited for adopting some of these practices and having their produce marketed in that way to achieve good prices in international markets. Just moving on quickly, some of the other programs, and I'm not trying to sort of present a shopping list of programs, but I think it's important to look at kind of the broader suite of initiatives in play in agriculture in this space. Another initiative from the October budget was just over $300 million for the next phase of the Heritage Trust funding. It's again a long-standing program from the 80s, But so this new funding is going to have a really strong focus on climate smart agriculture initiatives, and you'll hear more in this space over the next few months, and that'll sort of kick off next financial year. The Future Drought Fund has been around for a few years now. It is a fund that distributes $100 million every year in sort of drought resilience and climate resilience measures. So that there's a lot of sort of innovation hubs, adoption and innovation hubs, I should say, that are funded out of that and so forth, and also looking at sort of tools to support producers, better understand some of the climate impacts and sort of resilience measures that can be applied on farm. And National Soil Package is also a sort of a big funding program working with universities and research centres and states and territories to better understand the importance of soil in this space. Again, Margaret referred to sort of the role soil plays in sort of the carbon cycle and carbon accounting, and being able to sequester emissions in soil is going to be really important for agriculture. So you need to have that kind of foundational research and data to sort of make sure that change in practices and behaviours is sort of making a material difference on emissions, and there's some rigor and robust around how those things are measured. Finally, also acknowledging kind of the role states play. So states have got a raft of sort of programs in this space as well. So it's not just the Commonwealth, of course, and Victoria's got sort of a well-known pilot program at the moment, sort of supporting on-farm emissions action plans. Queensland's recently launched a 10-year sort of plan around sort of low emissions in agriculture, and providing quite tailored sort of advice for different sectors around how they can sort of reduce their emissions profile over time. And internationally, some of the reasons we're sort of convening this evening is really around that sort of international context. Both Australia as a large exporter of what we produce, but also we've got like a large council network overseas. Obviously, MLA has got its international services as well, and this matters when you're so reliant on exports, and being able to sort of secure those sort of premium prices requires a lot of investment from industry and government, and industry and government working together to secure access and position our exports in the best way possible. Next slide. Thanks, Brad. So I think Edwina at the start gave a pretty sweeping plug on all the activities happening in COP at the moment in Egypt. I think it's going to be interesting to sort of see and hear about sort of all the activities and connections that are made over there. Tomorrow's Ag Day, which is really important. There's the Australian government's got a pavilion in Egypt, which is hosting events for Ag Day tomorrow. So there's MLA's there, NFF is there, Sea Forest is there in terms of Asparagopsis, Bureau of Meteorology, MacDoc Foundation, and Farming for the Future initiative. So it's going to be sort of a hive activity, and looking forward to hearing all about it. So I might end there, Brad, and pass back to you. Thanks.
Thanks so much for that, Nick. That's a really good overview of the great work that the government's doing to sort of partner with the industry and support our initiatives to reduce our impact on the climate wherever we can. And next up, we have a producer from Victoria, Jenny O'Sullivan, who is on Cattle Council of Australia's Policy Council, and also sits on the Sustainability Steering Group for the Australian Beef Sustainability Framework. And she's going to bring us back to the grassroots and give us an understanding of what's happening on the ground on farms across Australia. Thank you, Jenny.
Thanks, Michelle, and hi, everybody. And Brad's controlling my PowerPoint for me too, so thanks, Brad. Look, I've been asked to give more of a grassroots perspective of what's happening on the ground across Australia, and also at the policy level with Cattle Council. My husband and I farm in South Gippsland. We're almost the southernmost point in mainland Australia. High rainfall there. We've got about 664 hectares, 14% of that set aside for remnant vegetation, shelter belts, and yards and houses and gardens and things like that. We run about 420 cattle that are breeders, probably run about 1,000 head on the farm with their followers. And we've got about 2,200 ewes, hope for about 140 to 150 lambing percentage. So have about 3,000 lambs on in the spring and they go off in January. So if we look at the amount of meat we sell per year and produce off the farm, we feed about 10,500 people per year. That's looking at domestic consumption for beef and lamb. And I think earlier Edwina was talking about food security, and that's something we're talking about at COP and is a bigger focus, which I'm very pleased to hear about, because I think beef producers and sheep producers right across Australia are very proud of what we're producing, and that we are contributing to a good diet, and it's something that gives us a lot of pleasure, and it's actually very important, that protein. Thanks, Brad. So for the farmers, and as Edwina said and Margaret said, we're farming across sort of half the landmass. We live with the most variable climate in the world. South Africa is the next variable behind us, 22% less variable. So as far as rainfall, temperature, we have enormous extremes. And as Dorothy McKellar in my country talked about droughts and flooding rains, we certainly have been seeing them across our country in the last couple of years. And as the scientists had predicted, we're going to see more extreme events more often with the climate change. Thanks, Brad. So this has an enormous impact on farmers right across Australia. So where we are, we're in a pretty safe area. You know, we normally have about 1,000 millimetres of rainfall. In a bad year, we might have 750 mils. In a very wet year, we'll have 1,500. So we still have to manage that variability, but it's much more of a challenge when you're in the north with much less rainfall, and when it doesn't fall, it has an enormous impact. But even for us, we've had to make changes on our farms with the changing climate. So we've had to change the time of our lambing, because the ability to finish the lambs and produce them for the market with the drier summers, we couldn't do it, so we had to bring it forward. And with our beef system, when Paul and I came back to the farm over 30 years ago, we had originally set up for the export marketing, producing for the Japanese market, and that was producing a bullock. But we really found, as the millennial drought hit and we got more variable climate, we needed the ability to turn off more animals so that we didn't overgraze. So we really wanted to manage our pasture cover. Soils and pasture are so critical, and have targets and achieve those things. So we needed a more flexible system. So that's where we've moved to more the domestic market. Thanks, Brad. When we look at climate, and we've been talking a lot around that, we're very fortunate to be having a sustainability framework that the beef industry has been putting out for a number of years now. And it does a report every year on how the industry is going. And as Margaret said, we've reduced our emissions by up to 59%. And we can look at actually what the emissions intensity are per kilogram of beef. So on average across Australia, it's 12.6 kilograms per live weight of beef. I've gone through the process that Margaret described, where farmers can map their production system to see what emissions they're producing. And on our farm, we're producing 9.6 kilograms per live weight. And the reason ours is 24% lower than average, one is, I guess, we've got the higher rainfall and the ability to feed the animals with grass better, and we have greener grass longer. But we've also embraced best practice. So we make sure that our animals are fertile, and if we have any unproductive animals, they're not kept on the farm. So cows that don't calve or don't get in calf are gone. Same with the sheep. We're looking at good fertility. We actually want to optimise the growth rates. So we're looking at good nutrition and welfare of the animals at all time. And with the shelter belts we've been providing to create a better habitat, it has further reduced our emissions to 7.6. And that extra reduction in emissions through sequestration is trees alone. So we've been involved with that Victorian pilot that was mentioned earlier. So we've recently mapped our emissions again, and we're working with them to think about, okay, how can we reduce it further? We actually don't think that there's a lot we can do for tweaking our system further without using those feed additives. So we're very, very excited with the research MLA is doing. Those products are now available in Australia, and the feedlots can use them now and take them up, but they're still not really available for pasture-fed systems like ourselves. So it's probably another year or two, but the work that they're doing with lick blocks and slow release capsules, we're very excited about. And they're saying the red asparagopsis could cost about $1 a day, and the 3-knot possibly about 30 to 50 cents a day per beast, which is quite affordable. And if we are hopefully going to get live weight gains as well, and if the market will reward us, that could be a really fantastic outcome. We're looking at doing more with sequestration. So the tree planting we've been doing, looking at maybe fast tracking that and doing a bit more, and also looking at some soil carbon projects, but making sure we do the monitoring first. And we've talked about the cost of monitoring. So we're looking at going down that track to further make an impact on what our emissions are doing. Thanks, Brad. But it's really important that we don't just focus on carbon. And I was very pleased to hear Edwina say that we've got different themes, because as a farmer, water is such a critical thing, and rainfall is so critical, and keeping the water on our farm and keeping the soil on our farm. And that photo there with my daughter, that was when we first came back here. This paddock, I used to be able to jump my pony over that ditch, but when I went away, I came back to the farm, and I could see that there'd been significant erosion happening. We don't have any permanent waterways on our farm. We've just got ephemeral streams that just run in the winter. And with the clearing that did happen in those early days, and I have to defend the farmers, and it was my grandfather who did a lot of it through this area, but there were government incentives to do that. And you actually couldn't borrow money from banks unless you cleared the land. The soldier settlers, they had their land taken away from them if they didn't clear enough in the time, because the feeling was that we needed to clear and actually over clear to feed the world. So I guess we've come back, and with the greater knowledge is that we need to slow that water down. We need to keep the soil on farm. So we fenced that tree breakout, and you can see my daughter there 20 years later. And that waterway has actually repaired. The water's slowed down, it's dropped soil and looking a lot better. And farmers are doing that right across Australia, and healthy water is really important for us and for our animals, but it's really important where it goes downstream and the impact on the fishing industry if that's going out into the waterways where the seagrass beds are. Thanks, Brad. The other thing that's really important, and again, I'm glad they're having a day of it on COP3, is biodiversity. And we are so lucky in Australia to have such incredible bush here. We've got state and national parks, but right across Australia on private land, significant amounts of bush. You can see our heathy woodland there, which is very, very special, and we love it. And the first thing Paul and I did when we came back to the farm was fence that off and protect that. And similarly, farmers have done that, and Landcare has been going over 30 years in Australia, and there's been an enormous amount achieved through that. Thanks, Brad. So the sustainability framework, which we've been producing for the beef industry, and the sheep industry has just produced one, talks about a number of things, and this webinar is about the gold standard in sustainability. So it's not just about the environment. That's very, very important, and it's great that we're talking about it at COP27, but it's also, for us, it's about animal welfare, because that is our business. We've got to look after those animals. We've got to be profitable, our businesses, and if we're not, we'll go out of business and it's not sustainable. And we've got to look after the people and community. So fair trade's been going on for years and years and been a thing about where we buy our coffee and chocolate. For us, it's a bit challenging because we've got such high expectations of what we pay and how we look after our people. Our cost of production is much higher than a lot of our competitors. But these are the areas that we're reporting against. Thanks, Brad. There was a really interesting study that's just been released by the Responsible Investment Association of Australia. And for them, the things their customers want to avoid, the top thing is animal cruelty. And it's amazing. It's more important than human rights abuses. It's more important than environmental damage. It's more important than gambling, than weapons and firearms, violations of Indigenous people, fossil fuels. It's pretty amazing, really, isn't it? So the consumer and our customer and the investor are very concerned about how animals are looked after. And so as an industry, it's really important we look after that. And they don't need to tell us that. For Paul and I, when we go to bed every night, and when we wake up every morning, the first thing we think of is our animals. Have they got feed? Have they got water? Are they well? It's very important. Thanks, Brad. Next slide. So Nature Positive, we've just signed up to the Global Roundtable goals, and we're working towards achieving that. It's really exciting to see that in the latest report that native vegetation regrowth in Australia has increased from 12.94% to 15.32%. We've got areas set aside like we have on our farm, but there's 7.6 million hectares across Australia set aside. That's larger than the size of Ireland. And we're now actually linked up with satellite imagery to determine what ground cover is and what's happening with forest cover and woody regrowth. And we're reporting on that each year. Next slide. Next slide. Thanks, Brad. So producers really must understand climate implications and work towards those. And we need to work together with all partners. And it's really great to see what MLA is doing, research and development. That co-investment from the Australian government's really important. The framework is reporting accurately the good and the bad about what we're doing. And Cattle Council and policy is very important for driving change and promoting what we're doing. Thanks, Brad. So worth visiting those sustainability frameworks if you haven't seen them. But we're producing a quality food that makes a difference. It's going globally, and we're trying to do it as sustainably as we can. And Australia's striving to be world class. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. That was really insightful and great to hear about all the things that are actually happening on farm. They're not too far from, business as usual, just good practice. So great to hear about that. We have got a couple of questions coming into the chat box. We'll only have time to answer a few of them, but there's an interesting question there about the feed additives that Margaret Jewell might be able to answer. One's about the synthetic production of the active extract and the palatability issues around that possibly, and the other is about the impact of seaweed production potentially on our oceans. Margaret, would you like to have a go at those?
Thanks, Michelle. So I might just touch on the harvesting seaweed on a large scale question first. So I guess to start off with, there's absolutely no intention that we would grow seaweed on a scale to supplement the entire Australian cattle herd. So it's just one potential solution of a suite that we are investigating. And we absolutely wouldn't condone the use of a supplement that was going to have a detrimental environmental impact somewhere else. That's not something that industry are interested in supporting. With regard to the synthetic production of the active extract, yes, as I said, there's not a silver bullet here, so there's a range of potential solutions. So we are looking at the whole seaweed product, which will be important for industries such as the organics industry, which won't be able to use some active ingredients that are produced in a synthetic way, and then other opportunities where we can extract our active ingredients and then provide a smaller dose, and they might be easier to scale, have a place in the mosaic of solutions as well. I think that might answer that one, Michelle.
Thanks, Margaret. And the other one that we have there from Richard is a really good question, actually. If we generate saleable reductions in emissions and then sell those ACCUs or Australian carbon credit units, is it right that those improvements can then not be counted towards carbon neutral by 2030 in terms of our industry goal?
I can take that one too, Michelle, if you like. Yeah. So that's a great question. Yes, absolutely. We can't sell our credits and count them towards our own emissions reduction progress as well. However, with the CN30 target, we've got very transparent methodology that's used that outlines the way that we calculate progress to CN30, and that goes straight to the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. So the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory compiles data from ABS and ABES surveys, remote sensing data from full cam modelling to look at land use related carbon storage and emissions. And it doesn't at the moment reflect what happens at the individual farm level. So while at the individual level, people can't sell their credits and then count them towards their own carbon neutral status, at the industry level, we still are able to report progress to CN30 that is agnostic to what's actually happening with the sale of carbon credits in the carbon market.
Thanks, Margaret. And looks like we're just about out of time, and I'll hand over to Brad to close things off.
Thanks, Michelle. And thanks to all our speakers. Thanks, Margaret and Nick and Edwina and Mark and Jenny as well. There were some great presentations. We really enjoyed it. And just reminding everyone that the recording of this will be available, and we'll send it out to all the attendees, and it'll be available through all our channels as well. And yeah, just finally, on behalf of Cattle Council and MLA, thank you all for attending and have a nice weekend. So we'll wrap the webinar there. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening, and thanks to all the speakers.